This week, can you guess why it's called Skeleton Park in Kingston? Yep, 'cause all of the skeletons. And what might be a formidable hollow, not spooky nor sleepy, this is Goblin Hollow. Have you guys been on the Haunted Walk in Kingston? I have, a couple times. I love it. I'm a huge fan of the city of Kingston, so hearing about a bit of the darker history and the ghost stories of the town is something I was seeking out, because I love the architecture and the age of the city. If I'm not mistaken, I believe it is considered the oldest large settlement in Ontario. You had like Niagara on the Lake, you have Ancaster, you have Kingston. But the first two didn't really grow to the size that Kingston did. And I know there was some controversy at the time when Ottawa was named the capital of Canada. They thought it might be Kingston instead. But Ottawa, I guess, was more strategically located for geography, if I'm not mistaken. Or just maybe they could, it was like a template. They could build how they wanted it to look. Of course, they couldn't knock down the historic buildings of Kingston. I'm not sure the exact reason. There must have been a reason. But either way, Kingston is a great city. No matter how you see them being passed aside for Ottawa as the capital, Kingston is a big part of Canadian history, definitely British Canadian history. And having those deep roots in history, then on the flip side, tells you that the place is going to be haunted. The type of energy that comes from this history, the events that take place in such a city over the generations that have lived there, something's got to happen. And I can see why the Haunted Walk would see the ghostly side of it so clearly and be able to create such a great tour, because the historic locations really support this. And they do a wonderful job. So highly recommend that. And also with Kingston, highly recommend the penitentiary. If you haven't been, they have opened it up for historical tours, and just the ability to go inside and see the place. I wasn't a huge fan of the history they decided to cover. I think I've talked about this before. But I was a huge fan of the former guards, prison guards, and the former workers coming back to tell personal stories of their time serving in the penitentiary. So highly recommend both of those things if you ever get on a road trip to the city of Kingston. But that is not why we are here today. Today, I'm using this opportunity to talk about one of my favorite stops from the Haunted Walk. It is Skeleton Park. Now, if you've never heard of this, you're going to get a lot of information from me. I highly recommend look up some of the old photos of what this was. But just to give you the overview before we dive deep, this is basically a massive cemetery that for some reason or another, maybe we'll learn that in a moment, they decided to turn it into a park, or what they called a commons. It would be an area that the townsfolk can go and gather together. Now, if they decided that they needed the space just because it was so centrally located, I'm not 100% about that, because it's not really centrally located. But if I look at the Google Maps, I don't know what they added after the fact. I mean, there is a couple of parks near the center of town, but then if you go beyond that, I don't know how historic it is, but there's City Park, which seems to be the massive, like their High Park or their Central Park for Kingston, and McBurney Park is just not all that big compared to it. So whatever the reasoning might be, this is what they decided to do. So I'll give a shout out to the Kingston paper. It is the very uniquely named WIG standard. That is WIG as W-H-I-G, not W-I-G, so you know what they're trying to say. But they did an article, and this is back in 1992, that detailed what had happened as part of the history of McBurney, a.k.a. Skeleton Park. So in the 1800s, they decided at this point to convert this burial ground, this cemetery, into a park. You might be thinking, okay, well, if it is just a burial ground or a cemetery, maybe there's only like 50, 60 people that are buried there. It could be like a family plot. No, this was their main one. And according to the article, it says that it's possible there were up to 10,000 bodies inside this old cemetery. With a mix of all different denominations. You got the Roman Catholics, you got the Anglicans, you got the Presbyterians, all making up certain percentages, but it seemed to be a split down the middle between the Anglicans and the Roman Catholics, which is strange, because as far as I know, usually the Roman Catholics will have their own cemetery. I assume in this case they were probably organized into their own section. That would make sense. So they did the conversion in the 1890s, which I think technically would have started before they decided not to do this anymore, or they had certain rules on how you were to handle cemeteries and burial grounds. So 1893, an act called the Certain Burying Grounds in Kingston states that the graves were to be laid level with the ground and walkways were never to be placed over them. So not as high of a respect as we might have today, where, the graveyards are the graveyards. You would never, ever, I doubt ever today you would consider digging up a graveyard to replace it with anything, let alone a park or a public square. But back then, it seemed they were a little bit more loose on the rules, because maybe, it's before the automobile is invented, so you think you're going to be confined to a certain smaller space for your city. So I'm assuming it's that kind of like seesaw teetering between becoming a larger town and knowing that you're growing, but also not realizing that things like the automobile, trains were around at that time, but the automobile wasn't, and definitely other modes of transportation that would be fast, such as the automobile, you didn't know. So you would assume that everybody would have to stay in their little center. So how do you build out? I'm sure they felt the pressure to have to replace certain things. And if you put the cemeteries in what becomes the main city, I'm thinking that they're dead, right? So they're not going to think, if we dig them up, who cares? You have more space. That's just a guess. That's just me trying to use logic. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree. Let me know. So over the years, this has been, quote unquote, adjusted, I guess you could say. So they didn't bother. I don't know if they forgot or they didn't know where the bodies were. They started changing everything. So they had to put in park benches. You have to install electrical wires. Later on, you have to have street lights and stuff like this. So progress definitely changed things. So there was also a story. This is coming from a local archaeologist. His name is Stephen Ross. He was the source for the article. But he said that kids playing in the park, they used to find these pieces of stone embedded in the ground, so they would dig it up, and fun thing to do. And some of the stones were so long and perfect shape, looked exactly like baseball bases. Now, if you know what a baseball base looks like, it kind of looks like it could be a piece of a gravestone. That's exactly what it was. So they were digging up these old gravestones, putting them down as bases, and then running around and constantly stepping on them. So it wasn't the most respectful way to treat the dead. So on the other side of it is, whenever they were digging up to install things like wires and park benches, what were they finding but bones? So they would keep digging up these graves that had been forgotten, not marked down, or a little bit too close to the surface for some reason or another, and they would find them constantly. Hence the nickname Skeleton Park, because of the skeletons. And it's not just the park itself. There was questions about how far this burial ground actually went. So when they were putting in houses over the years, they're saying some of the houses even infringed on the original cemetery grounds. Now, I don't see any mention here of when they were building the foundations, if they were to find bones during that. But they did when they were building a natural gas line. They were digging up for a line. They actually found a gravestone of somebody by the name of William Reynolds, who died in 1834. Says he was 48 years old. I did a quick search, but I wasn't able to find anything on that William Reynolds. But the name William Reynolds, there is another one that did exist in Kingston. I'm going up to the 1880s, which kind of fits the timeline. If his dad died in like 48 years old, add about 20 years and then 20 years onto that. It could have been an older fellow, so this could be the same guy. There was mentions of him marrying a woman named Wilhelmina Snyder, and also mentioned of him being a drunkard. Yeah, this one's here. I'll give you the beginning. It was yesterday, 3 young men named William Watt, William Reynolds, and William Harris. So 3 young Williams, badly offended on Queen Street in Kingston. They had been indulging too freely between 3 and 4 o'clock and commenced to wrestle and jostle and otherwise greatly misconduct themselves. So I don't know if it's the same guy or if he's the son, maybe grandson of the gravestone that they found, but the Reynolds name lives on in Kingston as well. I'm sure the William name lives on, as everybody in the 1800s seems to be named William. But in the end, I mean, this burial ground / cemetery is definitely old. And the disrespect that they showed it in the late 1800s, disrespect is probably not a strong enough word for it, because they knew, like from the maps, it showed a burial ground being there from 1814. Like, think about that. 1814, the War of 1812 wasn't even technically done at that point. I assume Kingston, or maybe it was towards the end, so Kingston wasn't as affected. Towards the end, it was more coming down towards Niagara, and then into the United States with the battles in Washington and New Orleans. But 1814, I assume they would have needed a burial ground because of the people who died during the war. I don't know for sure, but my guess is that they were probably some of the first bodies that were placed in what eventually would be called the Garrison Burial Grounds. You might be thinking, oh, Garrison's the last name. No, Garrison's actually a term, which 100% proves my point and shows to you guys that Ghost Guy Daniel sometimes knows what he's talking about. Garrison is defined as the troops stationed in a fortress or a town to defend it. And the fact that this burial ground was put in right after the War of 1812 tells me without a shadow of a doubt the reason it was put there was for the bodies. And over the years from that point forward, everybody starts coming in. This seems to be a very popular burial ground. Church of England was one of the first. They had 33 people at the very beginning. This is 1815. After that, the Roman Catholics show up. The Scottish Presbyterians show up. And it does say in here, as I mentioned before, they did have their own sections. So it's like their own plot or cemetery within a larger cemetery. So that makes complete sense. Church of England kind of expanded it. They were closer to Alma Street. We also had sicknesses. So over the years, you had sicknesses from a cholera outbreak. This was in the early 1800s. So almost like 200 people, 170. And in the year that Mr. Reynolds was buried, so he seems to be the focus of the article, Asian typhus struck in 1847. So that's another 300 people. And another 1,000 would be put in there over the next 5 years. So it seems like the bulk of it seems to be from the early to mid 1800s. Go up to 1864, and that's when they closed it. So they just we're done. There's too many bodies in here. 10,000 is enough. And we're just going to now allow, like within the church, you can put the bones, but not in the ground. And that didn't last much longer after that. We then fast forward to the 1880s. And at this point, they actually deemed it, quote unquote, as a neglected cemetery. So even though there was that many people buried there, I don't know why they wouldn't have, put the needed support into making it look nice. I mean, you had the churches around as well, but they said that it was a neglected cemetery in the 1880s, and that was the time that they first thought about converting it into a public square. So here are the rules, the instructions that they set forth for doing the conversion, not really mapping out where the bodies are, hence why there's so many left over, because I just assume they didn't know it's 10,000 after all. But, quote, the tombstones are to be laid level with the surface of the grounds, immediately over the graves which they mark. Graven cinder footpaths to be made through the grounds, but no driveways. The grounds to be planted with trees, shrubs, and flowers. The grounds to be maintained in good order as a public square, and the same as other public squares. proper police protection to be provided by the police commissioners. And in the end finally says, provided that no walk shall be made over any grave. Didn't take long. Almost right from the beginning, they decided to put pathways right over top of the stones. So the stones were buried and paths were put above them, which was immediately a violation of that act. But you might be thinking, of course, they just, they moved most of the bodies and maybe there was like 30 or 40 that were left behind. Again, I have to say no. And for this, we're going to go back to our favorite archaeologist here, Mr. Ross. He was quoted as saying, and is a very serious and well-studied man, said, quote, there are definitely, he mentioned this in a letter to the city as well, several thousand bodies still there. And one of the reasons why he knows this is in 1893, when the majority of people were supposed to have been taken out of that cemetery, the cemetery company who was overseeing all this only indicated 5 or 7, no, I'm not saying 1,000, 5 or 7 people in that year alone who were reinterred out of that cemetery, meaning everybody else left behind. I don't know about you, but this makes me think of the movie Poltergeist. And thank God it was just a town square. I don't know about the houses around that, if there's any experiences happening in those houses, but if you remember what happened in the movie The Poltergeist, you know what I'm talking about. So beyond all the mistakes and everything they did, which was disrespectful to the dead, it did end up becoming a town square. It was called Frontenac Park for many years. And then about 20 years before the 1980s here, it would have been the 1960s, a principal of a nearby public school named James A. McBurney, I guess after he passed away, they decided to dedicate the park to him. And to this very day, Skeleton Park is actually for reals called McBurney Park. So if you're going to look it up on Google Maps, guess what? It's going to say both. So it really doesn't matter which one you search up. They put Skeleton Park in the name. It's actually really cool. Look up the Google map right now, and you'll see it says McBurney Park, comma, Skeleton Park. And that's how you know that a town really embraces its history, good or bad. Now, again, I would highly recommend you go on the Haunted Walk to be able to go there in person with like-minded folks. Really get a feel for the space while standing on top of those bodies. That's how you really get a feel for it. But I will let you know that there is some general hauntings that are talked about in this space. One of them being about ghostly children. They might be thinking it's karma for the kids who use gravestones as baseball bases, but it's not. So this probably goes back to the 1800s, but you'll see the children running around and just kind of playing during the day, and then they would just vanish into thin air. They have called this, now this website calls it record skips, but I always called it residual. So these kids probably played on the grounds day in, day out, and because of this, the energy builds up, and eventually it's just like a loop that just goes over and over again. They have no idea who the kids are. Another legend states, if you go to Skeleton Park on a night of the full moon, when you might be thinking, well, I can't go into a cemetery at night, isn't it against the rules, against the law? Well, this isn't technically a cemetery. Yeah, it's a cemetery, but it's not. So you go into the park at night, see what happens. So this day, if you go into the park at night of a full moon, then for flashes of moments, you will see the full cemetery with the tombstones in front of you before it vanishes right in front of your eyes and the park returns. And another claim as well, now I know the Haunted Walk to not really go too over the top with their experiences. They are skeptical thinkers, which is a good thing to be in our business. You don't want to come in with stuff that's, way too over the top when you're telling ghostly experiences. But they have mentioned that some of the spirits of Skeleton Park can be aggressive, that some have actually physically hurt visitors and tourists during these tours. So for that reason, you always give that warning, because I have heard of these stories where people get like scratch marks. And we're not talking about a punch in the face. Like they might get a scratch mark, they might feel like a push, maybe on their back. Now, if the person was walking and they happen to be a little off balance, they might fall over and hurt themselves. So it is something to keep in the back of your mind if you ever to visit Skeleton Park. An old dirt road is said to connect Valley Field and Queens Road in Kings County, Prince Edward Island. Now, if you're not familiar, that is part of the Maritimes, located right beside Nova Scotia, not a very far drive from the city of Halifax. And at a spot where the road crosses the Montague River lies a place known as Goblin Hollow. And one of the main reports from Goblin Hollow is that visitors, when they visit, say it's quite foggy there, and it's no matter what time of year, what time of day. And as they go in, the fog tends to collect itself, and within this dense mist, people swear that they can see the apparition of a woman walking back and forth along the road, and as they get closer like a mirage, she then disappears. Now, who is this woman? They say her name was Ann Beaton. She was a 41-year-old single mother living with her brother and the baby on a farm in Lyndale, which at the time was also called the Back or Rear Settlement. It was a once thriving community that has long since disappeared and is only known to history today. Now, the following was written in a newspaper called The Islander from PEI, and this is back in May of 1859. It states that Ann Beaton left her home on the afternoon of Thursday the 12th of May and did not return. The search having been made, then on the Saturday morning, the 14th, about 11 o'clock, the body of the deceased was found by her brother Murdoch in a grove of bushes within some of 400 or 500 yards of the home she had left on the Thursday. And the body was mangled terribly. No less than 16 wounds had been inflicted on her head, neck, and mouth. Her brains were knocked out, her teeth driven in, and her mouth horribly cut. Obviously, this was deemed a murder, and when they did the inquest and they searched the area not too far away, they found something known as a grubbing hoe. Now, I have no idea what this is. Okay, never mind, I just searched it. It is a regular hoe. So a grub hoe and a regular hoe, similar type of hoe. So it was found in the vicinity of the place where the murder was committed, concealed under a fence with particles of blood and hair adhering to it. The circumstance created considerable suspicion, and the body was to have been disinterred on Wednesday last. It's back to the Islander. The citizens didn't like how the law was handling things, but I just want to kind of paint a picture for you, get an idea. This small settlement, there's not much going on. A woman gets murdered. It's a murder mystery. There's no such thing as Netflix yet. So you can understand that everybody was very interesting. So just imagine the entire town finding out that the constable or the authority is going around looking for the potential murderer. So what actually happened is they were following him around. So there's groups of people following him wherever he would go. Just imagine the pressure that you would feel trying to, investigate a murder with the entire town following you and picking apart every moment of what you are doing. It would not be pleasant, that's for sure. Now, at one point, there was assumption that a family was involved with this. They believed that the grub hoe belonged to them. So for that reason, they arrested the father along with the wife and the son just to make sure they got the right person. But as they continued to investigate, it turned out they weren't the murderers. I guess some type of evidence let them off on that, so they were just released. So they say up to this day, the murder remains unsolved. But the techniques that were used back in the day were a little bit archaic. It might be a good word. But there was this superstitious belief. It was an Irish settlement, I believe Gaelic. And one of the beliefs that they had is if you murdered someone, that if the murderer were then to go back and touch the dead body that they had just finished murdering, that blood would start to flow from the wounds of the dead body. That I guess the heart would start pumping again and push the blood out. So that was their belief. Very strange belief. So they actually tried it. I mean, it was a different time. So they call it an investigative technique. So where all the villagers, the entire village, since they were already there anyway, decide to line up and walk into a barn where they were keeping the body of Beaton. She's just laid out. And then every villager had to, it was mandatory, come up and lay their hand on the dead body. Man, woman, child, it didn't matter. So when they did that, they would then see if the body would start bleeding again. And as you can probably guess, that didn't happen. So being unsolved and knowing that this actual murderer is still out there, obviously people were scared. And a note in the Islander stated for years after, women would not go out in the dark, even if it was to take their washed clothes from the line. A man who was compelled to visit his own barn by night would awaken a child from sleep for the sake of human company. And this is how the town felt for years after. So it's obvious, if something like this ends up going unsolved, there's a reason for the spirit of Ann Beaton to still be restless, to still wander the area where her murder took place. The shock of being killed in such a way and then ending up in a place that you're familiar with, this is once your home, can tell me that a spirit can get stuck, not just talking about residual, but I'm talking about conscience. And this is the reason why, with the most violent type tragedies that happen, usually you'll get the most deep and energetic ghost stories of any in the entire world. This always seems to be the prevailing aspect of the situation that has to come from tragedy or come from violence or a quick, unexpected death. And that's exactly what happened to Ann Beaton, happened near her home, so there's even more reason for her to haunt the space. So as was already mentioned, of course, the fog and mist that kind of appears on its own and seeing the shadow of a woman walking beyond it. And as you get close, she just disappears. Another thing that happens often in the area that goes into history is complaints of riders on horses, and the horses get spooked, sometimes throwing their riders right off them because something scared them, even though there was nothing there. And more modern stories talk about automobiles, cars, being affected in the same way. Of course, the car wouldn't throw the driver out of it, but instead the engines tend to break down. They would stall on the road when driving through Goblin Hollow. And there she most likely still remains. Now, you're going to understand, in the Maritimes, when you have tales of ghosts and legends, they take them to a whole new level. And I love that it has roots. You have your Scottish roots and you have your Irish roots and your English roots all mixed nicely in the Maritimes throughout. And with the Irish roots, of course, you would have to have some kind of song that was written about Ann Beaton. This is 100% true. So the first verse is quoted on the site here, and I will read that out to you now. In Lindale there once lived a maiden, and fair was the cottage she stayed in. But light was her way and short was her stay. She was borne to the graveyard so early away. She was borne to the graveyard so early. Can't think of a better way to end the show. So, quick update, guys. On Facebook, I have recreated myself. My personal page has become a business page now. I am not a social media person by nature. So I wanted some way to convey like historical facts, quick ghost facts. These aren't full stories. They're very quick, related to pictures that I might post with it, interesting history that you might have never heard of, like Skeleton Park, for example, all related to Southern Ontario. You can see from Toronto to Niagara mostly. I might cover other areas and even into the United States for fun. So if you're on Facebook, please go ahead and follow or befriend me. Just go to Ghost Guide Daniel. Ghost Guide is all one word, and then Daniel after that. You'll see my crazy mug on there with the glasses and the hat, so you'll know it's me. Befriend me. I would like to be your friend. Anyway, that's the show, everyone. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.